It's just up, starting to populate. Good afternoon. Welcome to the session. We invite you all to get settled, get a pen, get a pad, get your listening ears together, and also let us know where you are logging in from today. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Chicago, California. Welcome. I am in Charleston, South Carolina. New Orleans, Washington. They're going by so fast now. We're from all over the country. It looks like everybody's represented here. We're going to get started in about a minute, so you do have time to settle in. Indianapolis. Welcome, San Antonio. Canada, welcome, Canada. Long Island and New Jersey. From Texas. Charlottesville, Virginia. Lexington, Virginia. A couple of Virginians in the group. Welcome. Okay, it is 1 o'clock, and we will go ahead and get our session started today. So, hello, and thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Shannon Jones, and I will be moderating this session. I am so glad to welcome Jonathan Shank from the University of Richmond, who will be presenting Threading the Needle, communicating the library budget information up and down the chain of command. Before we get started today, I want to go over a few logistical items with you. First, this session is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking the Live CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. I want to send a big thanks to Javier for providing these captions. Please also use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions you have. You can do this anonymously, and at the end of the session, there will be a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session for where we will get to as many questions as we can. We also invite you to use the chat for general comments or technical issues. My colleague Shanti will be monitoring the chat for any questions or comments. Shanti will also be adding some links into the chat. One is for collaborative resource sharing. If you think of a related reading, a podcast, a video, or something else that you want to share to Comms Resources or Tarot, or in the chat, we welcome that. One of the volunteers will also drop, excuse me, the link to our conference code of conduct. So if you need to access that link for any reason during the remaining during this session or any of the remaining sessions of the conference, please do so. And now I will turn the mic over to Jonathan.
All right, thank you, Shannon, and let me get set up here. All right, is the presentation showing up without the notes?
Yep.
Cool. All right, go ahead and kick things off. So as Shannon said, I'm Jonathan Shank. I'm head of budget and acquisitions and discovery at the University of Richmond, and I'm here today to talk about communicating library budget information. And we have a full hour for this session. I have it hopefully timed where there'll be plenty of time, 10 minutes or so at the end for questions and discussion. And I'll just be kind of zooming through the presentation and then try to get caught up with that with Shannon's help here at the end. So before diving in, I just want to give kind of the institutional context of where I'm coming from at University of Richmond. We're a liberal arts college in Richmond, Virginia. We have three separate libraries. I'm at Boatwright Library, which we'll talk about here in a second. 60 different undergraduate majors. We're heavily residential and have all of kind of the focus that you typically see at a liberal arts college: social sciences, arts and sciences, that kind of thing. One unique thing is we're the only university that has the spider for a mascot. That little guy on the right is Webster. That's spelled with a UR at the end. So we have tons of really corny web and spider puns here. You just kind of get used to them. And another thing that's going on our campus that's filtering some of my understanding of this stuff right now is that we're currently migrating to a new ERP, which is a huge budget related initiative for anyone who's been through that. That's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this today. So Boatwright Library specifically, it's the main library here on campus that I work at, and we serve primarily undergraduate students. For the size of our school, we're actually a pretty large staff. We have 40 FTE and a large number of student workers that kind of keep things moving and keep the lights on and keep the building operating. We utilize the liaison library service model, which a lot of you are probably very familiar with. And we're also undergoing some large-scale multi-phased renovations at the moment. So there's a copy shop and this whole facelift and changing of the front of the building that's going on right now. And then the second that's wrapped up, we have an academic skills center coming into the library that's really going to change our locations and our footprint, and also the mission and sort of placing and standing of the library on this campus. So there's a whole lot going on right now in the very short term. My particular role and perspective on this is shaped by, of course, my position here, where I'm the chief financial steward for UR libraries, except for the law library, and I'm overseeing all of the budgets. So that's collections, operations, and labor lines. I'm also the primary liaison with our Office of Planning and Budget and Business Affairs in that unit on campus. A big part of my job that I'm not really going to talk about today is that I also manage our acquisitions and cataloging and metadata units. And in my budget role, I co-chair a collections budget working group. I report directly to the university librarian, and the university librarian then reports to the provost, who oversees faculty and academic affairs and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm giving all this context because some of what I'm going to talk about later is making sure you know where you stand in the lay of the land and all of that. So I thought it'd make sense to model that in my presentation. And our budget here, so we have approximately $8 million total for the library, and that's split almost half and half between collections and operations and then labor on the other side. In the grand scheme of the university budget, that's $8 million out of $356 million in an annual operating budget. Our campus budgets, processes, and all of that kind of work are managed by the Office of Planning and Budget, which is part of a division that reports to the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the university. But then we report to the provost. So we are kind of a little bit divided on the org chart in that regard, which does make for some interesting challenges, but it's probably pretty typical. Within our budget, we do have a great deal of autonomy. Outside of the library, the planning, the OPB office, and other stakeholders mostly just care that we stay within our budget and care when we ask for more money or care when there's budget cuts. But otherwise, what we do with our $8 million, we can kind of move it around and shift things with quite a bit of autonomy without a whole lot of questions asked. And as far as our actual budget model, we utilize what I've come to understand and label as an incremental all funds budget model. And the oversight of that budget is through a shared governance planning and priorities committee, aside from all of the actual reporting structures that also oversee the budget. And all funds budgeting, if you're not familiar with it, it basically takes an enterprise view of the budget, looks across general and restricted funds holistically, and evaluates incremental requests in light of all the funds that are available, including restricted funds. So a big part of that is maximizing restricted funds, which at a university like ours, a private university that has a lot of endowment funds, that's pretty important. And if you're wondering why I provided a citation for what kind of budget we have, it's because that's not always easy to suss out, and I'll explain a little bit more on that later. So before I get into the meat of things, I do want to offer two disclaimers, and one touching on that topic of budget models. The budget model at your university may very well be very different. And there's a wide range of budget models out there. And some of the books that I consulted for this, there's 10 to a dozen different kind of models that are out there. lot of times the university will use a mix or overlap of a few different ones, which is what we do. But there's models out there, like some of you may be at a place that uses the responsibility center management model, or otherwise known as RCM, or zero-based budgeting or performance budgets. And those all look a lot different and work a lot differently than what we do. So hopefully some of my takeaways apply regardless, but there may be things that don't really make sense in your context. The second disclaimer I wanted to add is that just like any good conference, as I've attended some of the sessions in this conference, it's gotten me thinking, and it actually made me make some adjustments to my slides in the wee hours of last night before presenting today. And I just want to give the disclaimer that I know there's a lot of programming in this conference that's about sort of taking more of a critical approach to librarianship, or taking that step back and kind of looking at the big picture. This is not really that. This is more about working within the structures that exist at a lot of universities, working in the system, trying to find a way to maximize the value and the budget that comes into the library and the resources that we get, to then do the work that we do, and however whatever approaches we take. So I don't think that those approaches are at all mutually exclusive. And what this also isn't about is like management of personnel. So like the first keynote session, which talked a lot about personnel management and the critical approach to that, I don't think that any of that, even though that this is kind of taking a lot of the things that was critical of for granted and just kind of accepting them, I don't think that this is necessarily mutually exclusive to that, because I do think that this approach is perhaps going to be more effective for working with the budget stakeholders on your campus. So take that as you may. See, your mileage may vary from any of this, but that's kind of a disclaimer I also wanted to add in after sitting in on some of the great sessions so far. So why this topic and why now? Well, I've been in my role as a budget manager for 5 years now, and I've managed collection budgets before that. So I've been working on budgets for a while. And what's been consistent throughout all of the changes and personnel issues, policy changes, ERP migrations, all of that kind of stuff, budget cuts, what always stands out to me is not the fiscal control mechanisms, the math, making the budget, kind of landing the plane, so to speak, at the end of the year, making sure we're staying within budget. What's really the challenge for me, and what I spend a lot of time on, is communicating about the budget and walking that fine line, or threading the needle, so to speak, about giving the right information to the right audiences at the right time. So I thought it would be a topic to explore. And why now? Well, as I said before, our library is on the cusp of these really vast organizational changes. Our space is highly coveted on campus, and it's not exclusively being seen as library spaces anymore. And the budget is the lens through which many campus leaders and stakeholders view everything. And so I think it's essential to harness it as a communication and strategy tool, as I was saying in that disclaimer, to better position the library to then do what we see as our mission and our approach, and our embody our values. But we have to have money to make that happen. And as it's kind of a personal motivation, this is a good opportunity for me to sit back and analyze, reflect on my own practice, reflect on the best practices in the literature out there, take what I can, borrow it, and do some research, which is something that I really haven't done a lot of it's kind of been trial by fire with a lot of the budget work that I've done. So this is the first time that I engaged with a lot of the literature out there on budget management, aside from just kind of figuring things out and finding things at the point of need. So that's what we're going to talk about. And of course, money is the underlying resource upon which everything in the library depends on. So that's what we're talking about here. Or as I prefer, in the immoral words of Method Man from the Wu-Tang Clan, cash rules everything around me, cream, get the money, dollar, dollar bill, y'all. So that's the closest I'll come to rapping. Don't worry, no more of that in this session. So I thought at first, before we get into the budget communication piece, to go over some kind of groundwork or prerequisites that are required for effectively communicating the budget. To do that, you have to have an effective budget in place before you can talk about it, or else you're just going to draw attention to an ineffective budget. And a lot of this gets a little bit broad. It was kind of hard for me to keep the scope narrow on this. So this may seem like a lot, but I think it's broadly applicable to a lot of management issues that we face in libraries, not just with the budget. So first of all is having your financial house in order. And what I mean by that is one, determining what kind of budget you actually have. Like I talked about earlier, when you start as a budget manager, when you take over a budget, someone's not necessarily going to hand you like a guide and that says you have a all funds program budget that is you kind of have to just figure that stuff out on your own, and chances are you're taking it over from someone who's not there anymore, and maybe that knowledge has left the building. So take a step back and try to figure that out. Ask questions. When you're new, you can ask dumb questions and people will give you a lot of grace. So do that first. Understand your budget, all the accounts, the revenue sources, and their histories, and begin to identify and address chronic issues. That can take a while to figure out, but there's in every place you're probably going to run into that. I can't imagine a library that's not going to have some chronic budget issues and complicated histories that you need to uncover. And people are going to be key to figuring that out. You also need to just have access to the key reports and figures that you need, or people who can provide those to you in short order. And once you start seeing those key reports, you can start identifying key performance indicators, what in literature people always call KPIs, if you're not familiar, and which are basically your kind of standout statistics that actually show performance on goals or initiatives that you're trying to highlight. And if you are struggling with that, you might want to look at your budget structure and make sure that it produces the necessary data outputs that you need. And if it doesn't, you might consider adding additional layers to the budget. And so I found one article that was discussing like a fourth dimension of budget layers using like faceted budgets. There's a lot of relics in budgeting where maybe the accounting structure in like an old ILS like Voyager or something like that forced budgets to be structured in a certain way just based on the system. But in a lot of next gen ILSs, you have a lot more flexibility. So like we can have nth degree of layers to our budget because we can just apply reporting codes and then report out on them. So we don't even really have to have much. It's not structured so much as we just kind of throw these reporting codes in consistently and we can get what we want. But that was a big thing that we had to do. We also migrated to that system while I was here. So it took quite a bit of work and thinking to get through that. And you also, of course, need to know what the campus budget process is and who the decision makers are and what they need and look for when they're doing that. So this is already a lot, and this slide alone could represent years of work. And for me, it was years of work in my current job. But this is what you need to start at least approaching and working on as you look to also start communicating and doing outreach on the budget. I think it's also important to consider the local financial pressures that your campus might be facing. So depending on if you're an enrollment driven campus or a state funded campus or whatever your revenue streams are, there could be a lot of issues happening and volatility in those areas. There could be competing campus priorities. There could be a new initiative or building project that has nothing to do with the library that's sucking up all the energy in the room. So be aware of that. You're also going to often run into this perception of the library as kind of this legacy cost center. And the cost center meaning that it's a place that just costs money to support that doesn't generate any of its own revenue. Aside from fines and fees and maybe donations and fundraising, we aren't like a place that's taking in student money at a scale to support ourselves. So we're considered a cost center. And you'll also run into issues still with COVID-19 fallout and kind of the hangover from that and the ongoing ripple effects of the ongoing COVID-19 issues that institutions are facing and kind of climbing out of that budget hole that a lot of places went under. There's also going to be regional issues, market forces and volatility and all of that. And I found this quote helpful is that you just constantly need to study the mood of the institution, kind of that what's sort of beneath the surface and adjust your approach as those moods shift and try to predict those moods, which is easier said than done. But you don't want to be coming in with like a big ask right when something else just came through or something like that. So you need to kind of keep track of that. You can follow board minutes, just talk to leadership, just get the word out there, but follow that mood. So something else that I took a look at when I was putting together these slides is trying to understand the perspective of the outside budget leadership on the campus. So understanding the CBO perspective. CBO is an abbreviation you'll often see. It's college business officers. So it's kind of like the executive level, chief CEOs, chief operating officer, CFO, whatever title they have, but they're like that C-suite level budget finance person on the campus. So I consulted a couple of books that people like that might read and saw what they defined and looked at budgeting through the lens of. And in one of them, here's the 7 goals that it identified as budgeting: steering the institution through the investments, leveraging restricted funds, which came up earlier when we were talking about all funds budgeting, stimulating growth and entrepreneurship, supporting special projects. This one jumped out for me: rewarding and providing incentives for good performance, especially in areas aligned with the strategic plan. That's clearly one where communication is going to be a huge part of it. And then sustainability and risk management. Another list that I found in a similar type of book was define the roles of budget management as a mechanism for setting priorities, an institutional plan of action, an institutional contract, a control mechanism, a gauge of risks, an instrument of communication, a political device. So right there in the last 2, it's clearly, stating that budget is communication and it is inherently political. There's no bones about it. And you'll really notice that all of these except for one, number 4, are really all about more kind of like communication and strategy, and not, the accounting mechanisms, the controls, the numbers in place. And that reflects my own experience with managing a budget. That's, if you have the right systems in place, that's the easy part. It's all the other stuff that sucks up all of your time and energy. So yet another prerequisite I thought was at least worth mentioning is knowing the plans. And these 2 quotes, I think, help illustrate that. One, budgets flow naturally from good planning. Good planning does not emanate from adequate budgets. So the budget is not setting the plan. You need to have a plan in place that the budget then supports and reinforces. And then this one's obvious, but creating linkages between plans and the fiscal reality is essential for the library and its parent institution. So you need to know your library's strategic plan and values. You need to know your campus strategic plan and values. Hopefully those are already in alignment. If they're not, that's another issue. But once you have those in alignment, then you can start kind of looking at where the budget plugs in. You also need to understand your broader context. And this is another thing that takes a lot of time and labor. And you can do this by, constantly conducting environmental scans, kind of like the sensing the mood of the institution that I was talking about, but also learning the institutional culture, which is definitely, if you've jumped around, worked at a few different places, you know that every place has its own culture for sure. And for better or worse, you need to at least be aware of that and know how to navigate that to accomplish your budget goals at least. You need to know the articulated campus priorities. That's in planning, but I say implied as well, because it's not always, there might be other things that are going on in campus that aren't necessarily in the strategic plan, but that are clearly financial priorities of the campus. There's also campus politics, news, executive appointments, new initiatives. You've got to have that deep organizational knowledge and develop that through a network of trusted experts to be able to navigate communications. You need to be looped in on the relevant communications. And by that, I mean, be on like the right emails, the listservs, get on ones that maybe you aren't even supposed to be on if they are helpful. There's usually, if you ask, people are willing to let you kind of see into those things. I think it's also helpful to be aware of the library's overall financial footprint. So like in our case, even though the library, for the 40 or so of us that work here, the library is our whole world on campus. It represents only 2.2% of the overall annual operating budget of our campus. So that's a little bit humbling, but it also kind of shows where maybe it's hard to get face time when a big library issue comes up and you're trying to take it up the chain of command. It maybe not be as big of an issue to campus leadership. And so it's good to sometimes remind yourself of that and work through that. And another thing is to never forget that the students are your primary clientele. If you're at an academic library, that's your bread and butter. And it can be easy to kind of get caught up in the politics and the faculty and the leadership and all of that, but the students are still what we're all here for. And speaking more broadly to that campus context issue, I do think it's also important to keep in mind that the library is not alone in its quest for enhanced funding. Every unit on campus argues for more money. There's a typo there, sorry. And most can put forth persuasive rationales to get that money. So everyone's in the same boat as you. You may think that some of your causes are more worthy than others, but everyone kind of has that perspective. So remember that when you're advocating for your budget. So once you understand your climate, your role, the plans, all of the structures and everything like that, a specific recommendation I also have before you start to, or while you start to tackle these communication issues, is to develop strategic program budgets. And this is a framework. It'll be in the slide notes, the work site, if you want to get more details on how to kind of map this out. But basically, you're just aligning your budget with goals and strategic initiatives, and you're developing metrics to report out on that. So, like in our case, we have a strategic initiative to support a book art studio that takes some separate funding. So we've developed a program budget, and we track that kind of outside the system as a way to report on that. Another thing that may be obvious to a lot of people, but maybe doesn't come easy to all of us, especially a lot of us librarians who are kind of working behind the scenes often, is to be visible. And I found this repeated in the literature all over the place, that you need to be present, you need to build partnerships. You don't want the big budget ask that you make to be the first time that that person that you're asking sees your face and knows who you are, because that makes it much more of an uphill battle. And you want to define the library's role on your campus, listen and ask questions, and consistently get that message out. So I promise we're concluding these kind of prerequisites, but I do want to just give a plug for this approach, but also any other frameworks that may be helpful, because as you may have gathered, doing all of this is very complicated. There's a lot going on. It can be very easy to get lost and struggle to see the forest through the trees. So I found this systems thinking approach to be kind of helpful just for sort of organizing my thoughts and approaching some of these problems. Now, I don't think it's a magical solution to anything. I also don't think you need to go out and read a doorstop of a management book to get kind of some takeaways from it and apply them to your work. I have not read this whole book. I've watched YouTube videos on it. I've read some summaries. I've listened to a couple podcasts. And I found it very helpful to kind of organize some of my thoughts, to tackle budget challenges, communication challenges. And it's in really brief summary, systems thinking is kind of the understanding that all of these entities that exist across the campus, the real power or the real opportunity to influence change is in the relationships and understanding how interconnected they are, rather than just focusing on the entities themselves. So that's really it. That's kind of the takeaway I got from it, and I found that very helpful. If that's kind of too management-y to if you kind of cringe at even these type of theories, in this one, I kind of also see it as a parallel to what we talk about in the library world with linked data, where in linked data, the promise of linked data and all the great stuff we can get out of it isn't the entities themselves, it's the relationships that those entities have with each other and being able to harness those and analyze them at scale. So it's kind of almost that, but in a management context. All right, enough on that. Lastly, if you're tired yet, or if this all seems overwhelming, too bad. You've got to rinse and repeat. This is all a continuous iterative process. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be a big part of your job, and you're just going to have to continue on and on and on. Okay, so now I'd like to finally introduce a framework for budget as a communication tool. And just pulling this quote, I thought this was kind of helpful for getting started with it. As a network of communication, the budget is often the best way for an operating unit, department, or institution to express its objectives and to identify the resources needed to meet those objectives. So budget is a network of communication. It is often, and I would, in my position, is the best way for me to communicate. So you really need to harness that. You also need to begin shifting your understanding away from what we think of often with budgets as kind of an accounting or fiscal control system, but more to a communication tool. And the literature backs this up all over the place. Budgets are useful for committing and predicting resources. They're not simply tools of constraints. They can serve as a plan to financially execute priorities, a blueprint for deploying funds, and also highlight funding gaps. They must reflect and communicate our strategic plans, or else no one's going to want to support them, and it's going to be kind of unclear what your budget is for. And as has been repeated numerous times, budgets are inherently political. Politics are inherently communication. So a budget is communication. Another kind of outside of library budget book that I consulted endorsed this as well. And they provided the role of a budget manager with the following: sound fiduciary decision-making, informed listening, resource gathering, friend making, and fiscal problem solving. What do these all have in common to one extent or another is communication. So that is what you're doing when you're managing a budget. You are communicating. Taking it a step further, I also found and explored this concept called that I'd never heard of before, called a narrative budget model. And it's similar to what's often used in grant applications where you have to kind of explain what the money is going to be used for, but it's also apparently being used by some religious organizations. That's what a number of the citations in the article I found were actually these guides from some religious groups that were using this model. And it's to be used in conjunction with standard budget formats. It's not to replace whatever your actual budget model is, but essentially it's a souped up program budget where you're tying your budget areas to strategic priorities, and then you're giving these full narrative descriptions of those categories with qualitative examples, relevant stories, and so on and so forth. And you can use it, you could develop it collaboratively. It really would work better if you bring in staff because you would get those stories and that kind of sense from the library. But it also has to still be consistent and use accurate figures and still ultimately check out with the actual budget figures. And you can apply it anywhere that you would use those figures. So this is a new thing that I'm looking forward to exploring more and potentially applying here. And some of the benefits that's cited of it is, in the exercise of creating the narrative budget, you can help improve budget literacy among your staff and use it to drum up external support. It reframes the conversation and demonstrates library impact rather than just simply the expenditures and the increments associated with that. It can make the information more easier to digest. So this would be really important depending on if you're pitching the budget to the CBO, or if you're pitching it to like a planning and priorities committee that maybe doesn't need the numbers as much as they need to know why. And it clearly demonstrates impact and allows stakeholders to see their support of the library as an expression of values shared with the library. So whatever the values that you want to embody as a library, this is a way to really elucidate that with the budget rather than just sort of tie it together and connect the dots. And the intent of it is that it would be written in a way that it could be understood by any person outside of your organization. So it kind of does all that translating built into it. So that's another thing to consider in the budget as a communication model vein. So now let's get into budget communication strategies. And I'm going to divide this up as kind of the title of my presentation with the external communications, or up the chain of command, and then internal communications, or down and across the chain of command, so within the library itself. So my first recommendation for up the chain of command, and really this kind of applies down as well, is following a language style guide. And what this means is pretty obvious, but it's adjusting your tone to the situation and context, but also being mindful and avoiding unnecessary library jargon and acronyms when you're talking about the budget to an outside audience, and translating them when they need to be. This, I think it's easy for us to take for granted all the acronyms that we use in our profession, but if you're talking about stuff and using a lot of acronyms and the eyes are glazing over, you're not going to be an effective communicator. I think that should be pretty obvious. But along those lines as well, you don't want to like dumb yourself down. You can confidently demonstrate your expertise and your subject mastery of whatever the domain is that you're pitching, or the kind of on behalf of the library, because we do have so many experts and expertise within our institutions. But you want to make sure you're doing that without being condescending. And I mean, that also sounds obvious, but I've seen it firsthand where in conversations where unintentionally we can kind of come across, because we might get what we would consider dumb questions about the library. Like, oh, why do we still need a library? Isn't everything online? Well, yeah, that's a frustrating question for us to get, but you have to answer that in a way that's not going to make the person feel like they're being talked down to or something like that. And despite all outward appearances, higher administration and universities are often very, very smart people with lots of degrees and are really good at interrogating questions and making arguments. So they also don't like to feel dumb, which no one does, but particularly smart people in high positions with lots of degrees. So you just maybe walk on eggshells a little bit. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's something that I try to be really mindful of. Another thing, as far as a style guide goes, that I can't take credit for, but because I heard this at like an ACRL panel a few years ago, but I could never figure out or find who was actually the person on the panel saying it. But avoid passive language when you're talking about the library, like the library supports XYZ. and employ stronger active words like the library advances or furthers. It's a little trick of the tongue. It maybe sounds like a bit of a gimmick, but I think any little bit we can have in that package really kind of helps position us better. And lastly, there's quite a bit of literature out there from all over the place about communication preferences, generational differences. So I can't really begin to go into that. It's such a huge topic, but keep that in mind when you're communicating with anyone, really, including up the chain of command. You should also prepare for challenges. There's this adage, cold treat strategy for breakfast, that I always thought Peter Drucker said, or that's who was always attributed. But I guess being a librarian, I looked up if he actually said it, and apparently he didn't. So someone else said it. But it's still a good adage. I think it shows that you can come in with the best strategy, have everything mapped out, and the encompassing culture of your institution can come in and kind of smash that, or really kind of humble you. So don't take that in stride and just move on. And you're also likely to run into all kinds of challenges in big institutions, especially in higher ed: bureaucracy, red tape, structural impediments, cave people, which is the Citizens Against Virtually Everything, I think is what that stands for, I think everyone knows a few of those at their institution, and prevalent outdated attitudes and misunderstandings about what the library does. Oftentimes, I find that people who are, in the higher level positions at university, they've been in the university world for a while, and a lot of their experience and understanding of the library stops whenever they finish grad school. So that might be quite a while ago in some cases, and that's kind of their understanding of a library. So it's our job to update that, to do it humbly, to not be condescending about it, but to also be confident and expert about it, as was talked about in the last slide. So another quote that I wanted to highlight is to not assume the worst. And this was from one of the budget kind of management books that I found that wasn't specific to libraries, but basically I want to make sure I have time to get through everything, so I won't read the whole thing. But basically, when people in positions of power ask you questions or interrogate something that you're bringing in front of them, don't get defensive. Don't assume you're under attack. That's their job. That's what they do. They're there to find money, and save money and deploy it effectively. So take it in stride. And a real world example of this that I have that came up a while ago at my current job was we were doing some reorganization, moving some positions around, retitling a few things. And without getting into all the details, these 3 position titles came up in that reorg, or that transferring of things, for provost level approval. And at that level, the fair question came up: okay, you have an electronic resources librarian, you have a digital services librarian, you have a web services librarian. Can't one person just do all that? Like, why do you need all of those 3 jobs? They kind of sound like the same thing. And I think to most people in this room, we know that those are very clear jobs with distinct responsibilities and very different levels of or not levels, but types of expertise. But to someone who doesn't work in libraries, those all kind of sound like they could be the same thing. So don't be taken off guard when you get questions like that. Be prepared to answer it confidently, explain the differences, and should go well. It did in our case. We didn't run into issues. It was just a fair question that we answered. And an additional strategy is and this is when it's kind of a marathon rather than a sprint, is to develop and sustain credibility. And that can work. I haven't talked a lot about kind of the dollars and cents and the accounting and all of that piece of budgeting, but I do think it is important to model prudence and accountability, professionalism in those areas, have fiscal control over your budget. That's sort of a prerequisite to all of this other work. And as I talked about in the prerequisites, if there's issues with the structure of your budget or chronic problems in there, you got to address those first, or you're not going to be coming from a credible place. I will say, in my experience, I think addressing those kind of things is easier than all this other communication stuff. So that's the good news. You obviously also need to have strategic partnerships on campus. You need to be visible on campus, have networks. You need to proactively address gaps between the library budget and campus priorities. If the budget's not in alignment, that should be a huge red flag and something that you work on right away. And as mentioned before, you want to center the library and space needs on student success. Students are what we're here for. Student success is kind of the language that a lot of the administrative people on campus are going to speak. And so you don't want to come at things about just preserving the bottom line or solving a problem for the library. You want to position, you may have things for student success that involve preserving the bottom line or solving a problem for the library, but it shouldn't be just those in a vacuum. You should be able to tie it to bigger things like student success. And another strategy is to tactfully, and I have that bolded there for a reason, develop external library advocates and show what the library can do for them and not vice versa. And I'll talk a little bit more about the tact on the external advocates, but the second part of that, basically don't just constantly be asking for things for the library, also ask where the library can help. And then it's kind of a quid pro quo, and it can make it less of a challenge when you need something from them. And finally, be willing to compromise, accept and utilize give and take strategies. So again, kind of the quid pro quo thing. So when you look to construct your case for a budget proposal or any other kind of initiative or ask from the library, here's a few additional strategies. You want to look at the output side of the budgeting. So don't just look at what you spent on a certain area, but look at what the outputs are for that, whether that's usage, whether that's instruction, anything that can be measurable and that you can tie a key performance indicator to is where you want to kind of spend a lot of your time. You also want to separate expenditures from costs and highlight the actual full costs of library services. And what I mean by that is, if you're buying a book that's going to go on the stacks, it's going to circulate, that book may cost $40 if you're lucky. But the cost of getting that book out to students is not $40. There's the staff labor, there's the processing time, there's the vendor fees, there's this postage, and then there's the time to circulate and manage and all of that. There's everything down to the space on the campus that book lives on costs money. So come up with ways to quantify that and show that. Well, it shows that the library is more expensive than just the cost of the books and the things that we buy for the collection, electronic or physical. It also shows the added value of library expertise and services. It's one way to answer that question of, well, isn't everything just online, or can't we just have Amazon do it? I could give the example of, well, okay, procurement could buy a book, it'd be delivered to the procurement office, it would sit there, no one's going to use it, no one's going to know what to do with it, nothing's going to happen with it. That's what we do, that's where we come in. So another thing, and this is explored in a book that I have in the works cited a lot further than I have time to go into right now, but is developing return on investment and value of usage metrics. So that's, a lot of you are probably familiar with like cost per use or cost per article, but then taking those and combining them at scale to come up with like an overall number of the amount of money that goes into the library versus the amount of articles that students are accessing versus what that would pay out of pocket for individual articles compared to what we actually pay. Here's all the tremendous value that the library has by subscribing to these resources and providing access. That's really a brief version of that. There's a lot more detail in the Dugan book that I'd recommend for anyone wanting to work on this to take a look at, but that's an example of how you could do that. It's also important to be able to provide the information in multiple formats. So that harkens back to that concept of a narrative budget that we were talking about, to have the narrative tied to the numbers and have both kind of in your toolkit. And finally, highlight the unique numbers or the qualitative data. Don't just focus on kind of the general statistics, but also if there's some kind of standout thing that you can quantify from the last year, or a story or a qualitative piece of information, make sure you include that as well. Furthering this, I think it's important to adopt a growth mindset. And what I mean by this is frame your funding requests around areas of growth that are going to resonate with campus goals, not just about preserving your bottom line or preserving that even at worse at the expense of broader goals. Not just saying, if you cut this, if you cut our budget, we're going to have to cut this, but rather, if you give us this, we can add this program, or we can increase services or do X, Y, and Z. And you can do a little bit of a shell game where you can offset, maybe you're asking for a budget request that's going to, offset something else and free up money to still also support some of your contractual obligations, but it's all in the framing. And that's maybe, I shouldn't have said shell game, because later on I'm going to talk about how you shouldn't play those kind of games, but I'll explain that further. I think it's also important to benchmark against peers and be data driven. There's a lot of literature out there about specific examples of how benchmarking can be used effectively. But just one takeaway I have is that benchmarking can go a long way and kind of use the competitive motivations of campus leadership to your advantage, because everyone knows that the people at the higher level leadership roles in campus are all about keeping up with their peers. And if you can show where you're falling behind in a certain area, that can be a really, really effective argument depending on the context. And finally, I found some discussion about how to actually ask the questions, and it's can be as simple as breaking down the question into smaller chunks, but also don't have the request that you're making be the first time that you're communicating with that stakeholder. I think I mentioned that earlier, but you want to make sure that you have a relationship in place before that question comes up. And then a more broadly thing I recommend kind of in any context is to utilize evidence-based practice. And this is just one example I found from some literature about it specifically for a library application, and this sort of trifecta of these three areas where you can draw evidence from. And that's kind of what I'm doing here today. I've searched literature, I'm using my own experience, but I'm also using kind of local insights and examples. And I think that's a really helpful lens to have. Okay, so now avoiding pitfalls, and this is where things get a little bit tricky sometimes. You want to, as I said earlier, you want to utilize external advocates very carefully, and you want to also be sure that when doing so, the leadership already has some familiarity with whatever the issue that the library is having. And what I mean by this is external advocates are great and can do a lot for you where you're maybe stuck on something. Having someone speak on your behalf at a faculty senate meeting or something like that, students coming up in support of the library can be huge, but it can also be a way to lose control of the narrative. So I do think you need to be a little bit careful and make sure you're providing those advocates with the messaging and talking points that you as an organization want them to be sharing. And what I mean by this, I've seen this happen firsthand where maybe word gets out that the library is going to be cutting journals or something like that. And that's the only kind of message that faculty get. And suddenly, a senior faculty member is at the faculty senate meeting, roasting the provost about these journal cuts when there's still a lot more to be worked out, and the library has an approach that's maybe going to work, and et cetera, et cetera. So you don't want to necessarily like just sick the external people on the administration. You want to work in tandem with them and be very careful with that. Another pitfall that I've run into unintentionally myself is when you're providing big splashy figures to demonstrate impact, make sure you're ready to answer questions about them. And the example I'll have really briefly is I remember one time I was presenting to campus leadership about, return on investment for our serials budget and how, we spend X amount of money on serials and we get 150,000, we get access to 150,000 online journals or something like that. And to me, I thought, okay, that's great. That shows all the stuff at scale that we can get with our money. And the first question I got was, well, how on earth could you possibly be making individual decisions on what you're going to subscribe to and not when you have that number of journals? It sounds like you're just buying things without even really knowing what you're getting. And it was a moment for me to kind of take a step back and then I had kind of the uphill battle of explaining, well, we have aggregated packages, we have free journals that we're getting through our ILS. We have the ones that we're subscribing to individually, and it all kind of makes up this corpus of journals. But be careful about that. And when you get a question like that, don't take it defensively. Don't be caught off guard. Just be ready to answer it and be prepared. Like I said before, you don't want to play games. You don't want to be the librarian who cried wolf. If you don't know what I mean by games, there's all kinds of things that go on, shenanigans that happen in campus budgeting that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. People inflating requests, hoping they'll maybe get something close to that, withholding money, squirreling it away, providing worst case scenarios to leadership, or a counterfactual, like if you cut our serials budget by 0.5%, we have to cut ACS, and then the chemistry program is going to lose accreditation. When you constantly are making kind of the most extreme scenarios and almost threats, you'll start to lose credibility. Save that for when you're really in that situation, which some libraries, unfortunately, recently have probably found themselves in. And lastly, and this applies to here, but also to almost everything in life, is get all agreements and commitments in writing. People forget, people have short memories, people move, people leave, people retire. Get it in writing. I'm going to just skip this slide. I wanted to include something on fundraising, and I did a little bit of research on this, but this is probably the area that I have the least amount of experience in, so I don't think I have a whole lot of helpful insights to share here, but it's something that is coming our way, and it's something that I'm going to be working on more in the future, or at least I hope to, for a variety of reasons. But it's another, of course, part of external communication, a huge part. So finally, and lastly, I do want to talk briefly about internal communications across and down the chain of command. And I'll try to zoom through this so we can have room for questions here before the top of the hour. One thing to note on the scope and context of what I'm talking about, especially with internal communication, there's formal communication channels and there's informal communication channels. So there's the official messaging, there's emails, there's department meetings, but there's also hallway conversations, Slack conversations, all of that. And I think it's kind of a 24/7 thing when you're thinking about communicating on big important topics like strategy that you have to be mindful of. And another thing, the context may be different at your library. If you have a communication specialist, a PR manager, someone else with outreach or communication responsibilities, work in tandem with them. Don't just kind of go it alone. So what's the value proposition of doing this, of spending that time to communicate budget information internally, even to people who maybe aren't working directly with the budget? First of all, it helps the libraries form a shared sense of values and creates effective messaging that can then filter out through all of those people. It's also really useful for you as the budget manager because the workers who are closest to the services and functions themselves are going to have experiences that are unduplicated and that can really help inform the budget. And as we were talking about external advocates before, those can also be your staff who aren't necessarily in leadership roles, but find themselves in other different contexts on campus where they can advocate for the library. And again, dialogue on the budget with library staff is a tremendous learning opportunity for the budget manager themselves. So it's kind of a two-way thing. And to extend the value proposition a little bit further, I'll really quickly reference Oshri's Possibilities of an Organization. This is a book I picked up on from an Alex pre-conference on change management that I attended several years ago. That was really good. But basically, he contends that for an organization to be successful, leaders have to create conditions where employees feel responsible for the success, or a stake in the success of the organization. And you can only do that if they feel like they are involved in the big issues facing leadership. So that's really where communicating this budget stuff throughout the organization is going to pay dividends. So some general suggestions and approaches that I've used is provide staff with that broader institutional context, all that work that you're doing that was talked about beforehand in the pre-work. Don't just keep that to yourselves. Share that with staff, share your findings, share that context wherever you can in department meetings and informal communication channels, whatever the case may be. And in tandem with that, offer regular multi-channel budget updates to the entire library staff, not just to the leadership team or budget managers and things like that. Also, communicate library budget priorities and talking points. This is particularly crucial with liaisons, but it can apply to anyone because, again, everyone could find themselves in the position of advocating for the library in different campus contexts. And also that avoids that pitfall of having external advocates kind of going rogue and maybe not necessarily using the communication or talking points that you prefer. And a principle that can be applied here as well is community engagement, which is another huge topic that I'm only barely going to touch on. But one example that I've found after reading the literature that was really an example of communication that we've done at my library is at an annual all staff meeting last fall. I did a budget presentation where I went into a ton of detail and then kind of big picture about the budget. And it was for a lot of our staff, it was the first time that they'd seen a lot of this stuff, including even just like some things about the organizational structure of the university. So that's something I hope to continue to do every year. And it's really a way to get the community engaged in thinking about the library budget. And one kind of last thing here is a note on transparency. Broad transparency is key to trust and understanding. I think we all understand and appreciate that. But something I found repeated in a few different places that I think is worth pointing out, especially when communicating kind of internally, is that complete transparency without clarity is going to be meaningless. And by what I mean by complete transparency is like information overload, providing everyone with unfettered data about the budget and then no explanation. That's not going to really do anyone good. So transparency isn't as easy as just sort of opening the books and letting people see everything in the process, but you've got to do the extra work to give context and make that transparency effective. So finally, in closing, a reminder that your goal as the budget manager is not to preserve every budget line or get every dollar possible, despite what some may feel within the library organization, and something that I run into quite often. But it's also not to spend as little as possible and pinch every penny, which is what I get a lot of times from the budget people outside of the library. Remember, your goal is, and your North Star should be, to spend the right amount of money on the right amount of activity in the right amount of areas. And the work is in determining what those right amounts are and those activities. And that's where you rely on your entire team and all of the stuff that we've talked about today. And finally, keep in mind that securing adequate funding is challenging. It calls upon all of your managerial and political skills. And you must realize that at times you're going to fail, and sometimes it's not going to be your fault. And so just accept that, accept defeat, move on, take it in stride. Okay, so not quite as fast as I was hoping to be, but I would love to hear any of the questions that may have come up in chat. And also, if people just want to share any kind of experiences that have worked at their local institutions, I would love to hear that as well. And then if we run out of time too, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the schedule for call.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. People are really excited about your presentation and information you shared. I think we probably can get to maybe one or two questions. The first one is, which ERP are you moving from or to?
So that's an easy one. We're on Banner now, and we're moving to Workday. And we're an Alma library. So if anyone out there is a Alma Workday integrated place, we're trying to find people like that. So reach out. But that's our big push on campus.
We are.
Oh, cool. Okay, good to know.
Another question is, what program does your institution use for financial management? Oracle, Workday, Lucien. I guess you just answered that one.
Well, what we use, and this is part of why we're moving to Workday, is we currently use Banner, but then we have a tool called Roads, which I don't think is very widely adapted. That's specifically our financial reporting tool. So it lives on top of the Banner data. And for people who are on Alma, it kind of functions like Alma Analytics does on as like the separate entity attached to your Alma data. So within the library, we use Alma Analytics all the time for our collection stuff. But then for the broader budget, we're using the tool Roads, which I don't even remember the name of the vendor, but that's being sunsetted when we move to Workday. Everything's going to be integrated into that.
Okay, and then I'll grab one. What is your opinion on a library using a zero-based budgeting model? Did your library ever consider it?
So I'm only familiar with that in theory from reading through the literature that I've done for this project and for just kind of becoming a budget manager. My understanding of that is that you're basically starting from, you have no money allocated for anything, and you are identifying needs and then costs, and then building the budget from that. To me, that sounds like it would be very challenging and tedious, but it could, maybe be a way to really build in value to that process. But I have no firsthand experience with it, so I'd be curious to hear from anyone who has, but I really don't know.
And I think we might be able to get one more. Says, could you share an example of a section of a narrative budget?
A section of a narrative budget. So again, this is something new to me as well, but from what I recall from what I read about it, they would take like the money tied to a particular piece of the collection, like say electronic resources or maybe databases or something like that, or even a service. So if you wanted to look at labor and you wanted to look at like the hours that were going into instruction, then explaining, rather than just having it be a column on a spreadsheet or a figure, explaining what that is and explaining the impact of it. And so like with collection stuff, you could tie it to some of those value of usage metrics that I briefly touched on. But that's also something that I'm looking to explore further and looking for ways to apply it. But that's at least my new understanding of how that works. And when the slides are up, it's in the works cited, the article that talked about that, which I'll scroll. I have a bunch of sources, so those will all be on the Calm website when those go up.
Okay, so Thank you again, Jonathan, because we have about 2 minutes left in the session. So, thank you for answering as many questions as possible. Jonathan did invite you that if your question did not get answered, to contact him directly for with your question, or just to get some insights about his presentation and about his expertise with budgeting. But before we close out the session today, I do want to point out the evaluation survey that is available to you to complete. I am sure that Jonathan would be very appreciative of any feedback that you all share about his presentation. You can find a link to the evaluation and sketch is labeled feedback survey, and it is directly above the session description. So again, thank you, Jonathan, for an amazing presentation, and thank all of our attendees for your engagement this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and as I'm judging from the chat box, I think you all did, and enjoy the rest of the conference. So y'all have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.